let's get ready to go. Eric, we're recording? Yes, we are. Oh my goodness, we've been recording all along. We'll have to cut some stuff out. Okay, welcome everybody to our monthly Lunch and Learn. For this Lunch and Learn, we decided to go very topical. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, masks off and getting ready to re-enter business as normal in whatever that new normal is going to be. So we look forward to what our participants have to say about their expectations of our new normal. First of all, thank you very much for our panelists. Anna Guglietta from Stuart Olson, Stephen Knight from Mosaic Home Services, Amir Shami, Rotaflow, and Christopher Munro from Roper Grail in BC. So with that, let's get going. So I would like the panelists just give us a little bit of background about where you are. What do you see the key trends will be that will affect business in 2021 and beyond? We can let go of that slide. Thank you. Awesome. Christopher, you're to my left. What do you see? What are the key trends that you see going?
Sure. Well, I think in my practice, which is labor and employment law, remote and hybrid work are the obvious trends that are coming out of the pandemic. Nearly every day we're seeing a study or a poll that comes out that suggests that workers are really looking for flexibility. And that's flexibility to work where they want, when they want. Obviously that's not always possible. Some workplaces, industrial workplaces, for example, it's simply not possible to offer that. But for many office environments, I think the pandemic has taught us that remote work can work, and then employees want the option to be able to come to the office when they want or to work remotely when they want. With that said, I wouldn't advise giving up on your office space just yet. I think we're going to see a mix in the future, and employees will still want the option to come to the office sometimes. But I think that a lot of employers are going to need to make it a choice or risk losing a lot of key employees to other workplaces. I've just been reading that some of the large accounting firms are actually doing away with some or all their physical office space. So I think we'll see that a trend throughout the next year or two. Also, I think there's an increased health and safety awareness for employers. So we've seen through the pandemic that workplaces have been a major source of spread of COVID-19. And coming out of the pandemic, I think a lot of employers now are much more aware of their obligations to provide a safe workplace, including by having plans to deal with communicable diseases like COVID-19.
That's great. Thank you very much. Stephen, we're hopping over to you.
Sure, and Christopher, I'd echo a lot of your comments there. I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta, and I own a company called Mosaic Home Services in the home improvement space and the home renovation space. And I would definitely echo the flexibility that employers are going to need to offer staff. And I mean, in our industry, that's a little bit tough. I can't have a remote worker, paint a wall. There still needs to be somebody there physically doing that work. So it's going to come down to how, employers in our space, do the temperature checking and the COVID screening, and how much of that remains and how much of that goes away. We still need to kind of take our best practices from our local health authority on what we do moving forward. While we see restrictions starting to lift, especially in Alberta, the burden isn't over for us to make sure that our staff are safe, our customers are safe. But I think a major trend, especially in the small, medium enterprise market, will be actually outsourcing some of those administrative tasks more than we've seen before. Now that, workers even locally are looking at flexible or hybrid work arrangements, I've seen a lot of people in our industry look at, outsourced bookkeeping or outsourced call center services that aren't necessarily employing people in our local communities. They're moving more and more things offshore because it's been kind of proven that it can be done now. The other big trend that I see in our industry goes around supply chain. You'll see a lot of people in the residential and light commercial construction market look to vertically integrate whenever they can, because right now and throughout COVID, we've seen such disruption in supply chain And basically, price is no longer an objection for some buyers. The price doesn't matter; it just matters when you can get things. And just knowing our economy and the way in which these businesses operate, operators won't let that opportunity pass them by again. They'll vertically integrate their supply chains so that if this ever happens again, they'll be able to have product on hand, have the ability to provide whatever clients need at a price point that the market will demand.
Oh, thank you for that. Interesting. Anna.
Well, similar to what Christopher and Stephen are saying, definitely the one thing that we're seeing from the employee side is the need for choice. So I won't repeat those comments, but I will say this: people have taken during the last 18 months a pause. And choice is, yes, hybrid remote is part of choice, but now it's choice around organization. With remote work comes a lot more opportunity. And so is the organization I'm now working for connected to my purpose? Because in this pause, I've actually reassessed a few things. So it's choice. It's a connection to purpose, not just organizational, but an employee's purpose and what they want to do to design and navigate their career. And then from an employer's perspective, a mindset around learning. We're in this almost with a beginner's mindset in that, yes, we've been away for the last 18 months, but most of us have all been in that scenario. Hybrid makes it even more complicated. Discussions that used to happen in the hallway will not be happening in the hallway. And yet for parts of the team, it will. So how do I still fit in and feel like I belong if I'm not with my boss and my teammates, because that's something that I choose? So there is uncertainty on both sides, and both groups, I think both the employer and employees, trying to figure out and navigate. And I hate to use the word because we've overused it in the last 18 months, and pivot. So when it's not working, okay, so what can we do to make it work? Mm-hmm. So flexibility, constant check-ins to see if things are moving in the direction that employees and teams and leaders are looking for it to move, and a deeper conversation. What is this pause? What clarity has this pause created for employees? And then how can we support what they're looking for go forward?
Wow, thank you very much. I love the beginner's mindset thing. That is so, that's very profound. And I can see that definitely just about everywhere. Amir, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, most of the topics being covered by the fellow colleagues. And to add, I see a lot of merger and acquisition happening nowadays. And definitely that changed the landscape of the business. Sometimes create a gap. Sometimes those emerging consolidated companies can definitely be a threat for the small players or local companies. But as Stephen mentioned, supply chain definitely is a new topic for us as an engineering construction company working in oil sand. Supply chain is crucial. And now is not the matter of price, it's a matter of even availability. So which company is very flexible and fast and agile, can supply faster and quicker, is the winner, not necessarily the cheapest one. Another thing that shows itself is companies that adopted technology before pandemic, they actually leveraged and scaled up. 2-3 years ago, having Zoom, Teams, Skype was a good option. Now is definitely a necessity. And I see these are not going away. Many companies are bringing people back and still they're running meeting on Teams. They're sitting in their own offices. It's just more convenient. You can share the screen, the scorecard, and a lot of things. So it's kind of weeding out those old school practices and needs a new mindset and needs more proactiveness by HR and the leadership team to attract people who are technology savvy. So a lot of things are going out. Some of those are threats, some of those can be flipped to challenge, but definitely is an interesting era after pandemic.
Thank you very much. So for attendees, if you have any questions for the panelists, please type it into the Q&A. We have a round of very targeted questions for our panelists. And as your questions come up, Eric will flag me and we will find somebody to answer your question. So in this 18 months of giving the world a big squeeze, it's not the first time the world had a pandemic. It's definitely the first in our, and hopefully the last in our lifetime. In previous pandemics, such as the bubonic plague, London in the south of England, the University of Cambridge sent all their students home. And that was when a young student by the name of Isaac Newton sat in his garden. He didn't have an iPhone to play on, and just stared into middle distance, observed an apple fall, and ta-da, there's Newton's law. A similar type of innovations or insights or changes that radically changed the world, the way we would see the world, the way science operates, happened during the Spanish plague in the beginning of the previous century. So what major changes happened during this 18 months that will impact the way we see the world, the way we work, the way science operates, the way we work going forward? So Amir, my first question is for you then. What innovations developed in the plague that you can see in your industry, and how will it impact the way you guys work?
So it's not necessarily a very novel innovation, but it's the way that doing the business is being more result oriented. As the companies are outsourcing a lot of services, you need to have a way to measure the product based on the outcome, not hours you're spending on it. And that covers most of the industry, even our own team. An accountant, not necessarily 8 hours, sits in the office and you measure the hours are working. You need to look at how you can set up the expectation, KPI and deliverables, and be much more result oriented. Most of the clients also are migrating from being time and material to result oriented or lump sum or deliverable based. So adopting the business model to being more result oriented, that's a kind of innovative way that you can look at any scope, including construction. Being more as a old school, charging everything to clients and even hiding the deficiencies or inefficiency way of doing the work will not be competitive in the new environment. Applying technology, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important. Having a strong supply chain that has access to the local market as long as international market is very important, and being more resourceful. Nowadays, most of the clients are looking for companies that are one-stop shop, much more resourceful, and they can tailor or fashion their product based on clients' need. That flexibility definitely is much more needed in this time.
That is really interesting because, I mean, most of us have been to business school at some stage in our lives, and that is a practice that was preached even in the 80s and the 90s. It's like, look for outcomes, not time spent behind a desk. The time spent behind a desk does not really result in anything necessarily unless they're actually doing work behind the desk. And the concept that people had to switch to that because you don't know how much time somebody is spending behind a desk. And I had so many clients that actually had semi-panic attacks, like, oh, everybody's at home. I don't know whether they're working. I don't know whether things are happening. It's like, are you getting results? So thank you for raising that. That's really an interesting point. Stephen, your question is, what are most important factors for business leadership to consider in navigating the opening up of the economy and getting back to some level of a new normal?
Well, I think that Anna had some really interesting points about vision, culture, and employees and team members wanting to buy into a vision. And for me, when it comes to thinking about what does leadership look like and how can leadership get the world back to a closer form of normal, in my mind, it's actually quite simple. We as leaders need to simply treat people like humans. We need to admit that we don't have all the answers. This is an unprecedented time. It's a time that we've never led through. We've never led organizations through a pandemic. We've never led our families through a pandemic. And what I truly believe as we come out of this, we're still just as much in the dark as we were in the early days of COVID, where we didn't know what the health restrictions look like. And we still don't know what the health restrictions look like as we come out, or we don't know what supply chain looks like, or we don't know what, how many staff we're going to need, or what day we're going to be there for the customer. And just in order to effectively transition into a post-COVID world, if you can call it a post-COVID world, you need to be human with people. You need to accept the fact you don't have all the answers. You need to be honest with people that you don't have them. And if somebody comes to you and says something like, you know what, I want to work from home because I need childcare, or I want to be able to care for my kid while I'm there. Well, you need to be able to create a workspace where it's okay for you to have a constructive conversation with that person about the fact that you're employing them to do a job, not care for their kid. And you need to be able to create a safe enough work environment where you can talk to a supplier about what you need and when you need it there. And they need to be able to respect you enough to have a conversation about what their ability is to get it there. Really, we've come through an incredibly difficult period of human history. No one has all the right answers. And if you're expecting someone to, right at the drop of a dime, just take a minute and realize that they're a human too. They're going through this the same way that you are. So behave like a human, ask for input, make your decision and stick to it, but accept that not all of us have the right answers, no matter what our title is or no matter what our job is.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on those?
I just would add that, what Stephen just said, treat people like humans. I mean, that's so much of the advice I give on a daily basis. And I think you could summarize a lot of employment law or labor law in that way, is treat people with respect and with dignity like humans, and you'll avoid a lot of problems. So I thought that was a really excellent point.
Thank you. Anna, you were.
Yeah, I just wanted to anchor off that thought of we don't have all the answers. And that move to being open about that is what employees are looking for, because they want to be part of the solution and informing the solution go forward. So if our old way of thinking was, I know exactly what we're going to do next step, then the new way of thinking is, I'm not sure, and I'd like to talk to you about what is possible. And I think that'll go a long way with employees, especially if we have to reset because something isn't working. Starting with, we're not sure, but this is what we're going to try, I think will go a long way.
Thank you for that. Okay, my next question is for Christopher. Blended working, hybrid work has been proven to be a viable option and may change labor landscape forever. How is this going to impact labor legislation? Can you force people to be on site? What's happening?
Yeah, and I mean, so far, there actually hasn't been a lot of change, or a lot of lasting change. I mean, we saw how quickly the provincial governments can act, federal governments can act when it came to enacting COVID-related leaves, changes to layoff regulations. I mean, those happened so quickly. But broader changes to labor and employment law is highly controversial. It takes a tremendous amount of political will to make those changes, and they take a lot of time. They're going to depend a lot on the government that's in power. So obviously in British Columbia here, we have a labor-friendly NDP government that's looking to pass some changes about sick leave, I'll talk about in a moment. Obviously Alberta is an entirely different situation. Ontario is an entirely different situation. And so far, really not a lot of lasting changes. All of the same rules apply to remote or hybrid work based on the physical location of the employee. So if you're looking to hire somebody in another province, you're going to have to be aware of those provinces' employment labor laws, because that is what's going to apply to that employee. Even if your head office or home base is in Alberta, you may have to be looking at BC laws, Manitoba laws, etc. And a lot of these requirements can really, I think, negatively impact a lot of what employers would like to do when it comes to hybrid and remote work. So the ESA in every province requires that the employers keep very detailed records of hours of work, and ensure you pay overtime properly, ensure you monitor holidays and vacation and time off. All these requirements are on the employer. And when you've got a remote workforce that you're trying to empower to do the work when and where they want, all of these record keeping and other obligations make it more difficult to do that. So for example, if you're not monitoring vacation and you get a complaint, well, then you're gonna have a hard time proving you granted that employee vacation, even though you might have told the employee, take the time you need, work when you want, take vacation when you want, as long as you get the job done, I don't care when and how you do it, empower your employees, but then you've got to also keep all the records of that. So you've got a real tension there. So what I'd love to see is the government to pass some legislation to allow more flexible overtime averaging, for example, or to relax some of those hours, those record keeping requirements around hours. I'm not sure we're going to see that in the short term, but as the remote workforce expands, hopefully we see some pressure on the provincial governments to enact that type of legislation. At the same time, employees also need protection in many cases, because obviously there are some unscrupulous employers out there that could take advantage of these situations. So it's a real balancing act, and that's why it's so difficult to change legislation. A few things that are happening right now is sick leave, and in some cases paid sick leave. So in many provinces, including BC, Ontario, Manitoba, there are temporary paid sick days right now for COVID-19. So Alberta is a bit of an outlier in not having that, although I did see that a bill was tabled to provide that type of paid leave. BC is talking about making that permanent. So there's been a lot of pressure on the federal government to change this EI sickness benefits to make them more flexible, remove waiting periods, and increase the benefit rate so that people can stay home if they're sick. The federal government's essentially said they're not doing any of that. And so the provincial governments have started to do it. And BC is going to, or have said that they will be implementing a permanent paid sick program starting probably sometime in the fall. They're working out how that's going to work right now. Currently, for the temporary COVID-19 paid days in BC, Ontario, Manitoba, there is some reimbursement available from the provincial government if you're required to grant those sick days. And they're quite limited, sort of 5 days, 3 days. It depends on the province. We're also seeing virtual hearings at every level. So labor boards, employment standards tribunals, arbitrations, court cases. I mean, everything is going virtual now, which I think is a great thing to have. It's great for employers and employees because it's more convenient. You save lawyers' fees, you save time, you save all those things associated with travel to and from a hearing. So I think that's great news. And I think that virtual hearings at every tribunal and court are here to stay, at least to some extent. We're also seeing more guidance and more enforcement of occupational health and safety standards. So those standards are already there, but we're seeing increased enforcement and again, increased pressure on employers to ensure that they are following those guidelines and keeping their workers safe. British Columbia, as part of their move to the next phase, has actually announced that they're going to be requiring employers to have communicable disease plans. Those were always a requirement, but I would say 90% of employers probably don't have them. It was never really an issue before. But now with COVID and with pandemics and the possibility this happens again, I think we're going to see more enforcement of the existing occupational health and safety rules for employers. I think those are the key things that are changing right now. Again, it's very difficult to change employment and labor legislation. It's very controversial. You have pressure from organized labor, you have pressure from employees, gig workers, employers, and the government's task is to balance all of those things. And that's a difficult task to do. And one of the reasons why we only infrequently see substantial changes to that type of legislation.
Thank you, Chris. In that same way, I have a personal curiosity here. So through the pandemic, we became very sensitive to people who have the sniffles. So somebody comes instead of coming to work, has to take a sick leave because they have a mild cold or are in some way, shape, or form germ infected or have a virus. So we ask them to stay at home. If they not that sick, they could technically work. But if they're terribly ill, they couldn't. How do we know whether that is a work from home day or a sick day?
I mean, that's a difficult issue. We are seeing some indication from WorkSafe BC, at least, that in the future, they may actually be recommending that people stay home if they're sick at all. So things like the common cold might be a situation where employers are obligated to actually say, stay at home. Again, it comes down to trusting your employees. So if you can provide for that remote work option, if that's viable for you because it's office type work or computer work, then I think you can say, look, if you're well enough or you feel well enough to work from home, do so. And we will treat it as a regular working day. But of course, in some industries, that's not possible. There is no work to be done from home. And so in those cases, you may be looking at a paid or an unpaid sick day, depending on the rules in your province and what benefits programs you offer to your employees. So, it's a tricky issue. And I think we've seen the pressure. Employees feel in many cases they can't afford to stay home if they're sick because there's no sick leave program. They have bills to pay and they want the ability to work, and they may refuse to stay home. And so depending on what the loss is or how it's changed over the next number of weeks and months, employers are going to have probably a battle with some employees about whether they're allowed to come to work or not. And it's going to be a difficult management issue.
Yeah, can definitely see that. Thank you very much. Okay, our next question for Anna. Working with a hybrid team has been proven to be a challenge for team cohesion, communication, team culture. What strategies have you seen or innovative ways of doing things have you seen that might be effective?
Yeah, so again, the mindset is continual improvement, but I'm going to just touch on a few things that we're seeing that have proven to work in a lot of different situations. The first is creating clarity. You can rip up a team or the essence of a team if people aren't clear on the expectations. So clarity around what's expected in terms of time, if there is any. What's expected in terms of technology. So if I do choose to work hybrid, are all teams, similar to what Amir mentioned earlier, all team meetings going to be using technology? Will I give up my office? So creating a policy that outlines or guidelines that outlines all of these elements creates a common understanding for everyone. Those that are completely remote, those that are hybrid, or those that may be full-time in the office. So common understanding and clarity of expectations goes a long way with keeping the team feeling connected and have common understanding. The second piece is around communication. We talked a little about it a bit earlier, but communication and both the informal and formal route. So part of why we enjoy work is the human connection and the communication informally that spurs that connection. How do you create virtual situations that allow everyone to feel like they belong on that team? Mm-hmm. So many people have done that well. So many groups and leaders and teams have come together over the last 18 months and have done that well. How do you carry those strategies forward? Check-in. What was important to employees 18 months ago may not be important to those specific employees now. So how do you create the environment where it is okay for someone to say, I'm actually not interested in moving into that position that we had talked about? Because that may mean several different things for my life. And that's not where I want to be after this 18-month pause and reflection. Celebration. Culture is part of celebrating and staying again connected to one another. And this isn't the first time where we have led dispersed teams. And if we've had teams that have been across the country, we've still found ways to bring people together and celebrate and bond. You can roll your eyes at HR says it's a team building event, but it builds culture. It builds cohesion. So if you used to do things once a quarter or once a month pre-pandemic, and you brought people across all parts of the country, you can still use that opportunity to bring people even across the city, where everyone's expected to be in the office on a certain date. And here are the things that we're going to do, including business. But having that all laid out in terms of expectations in a policy that you still will be required, if that's appropriate, to be in the office once a month or once a quarter. Laying all of that out is important for people as they start to think about the logistics that they need to change to accommodate this new way of working. And lastly, how do you check in to see that things are going okay? So are they feeling productive? Are they feeling that they are progressing in both their work and in their careers? Are we missing the opportunity to grow from one another and develop because we used to see the way Christopher handled that meeting, or Christopher did something in the office that I can no longer see? I'm just picking on you, Christopher. But some of that is changes it's hard for people to know how things are done around here when we're all doing them in different locations. And so that brings me to my last point. How do you onboard someone and have them connected to the culture, the values, the behaviors, and how things are done around here when they actually don't get to see everyone and how things are physically done around here? So it really needs to be more intentional. Everything needs to be more intentional. Communication, celebration, clarity, and connection.
Well, that's a whole new way of managing to a certain point, Anna. It's like all things that everybody should have been doing, but may have been parked in favor of production or results or more sort of a task orientation. So we're going to train leaders and managers to become more relationship focused, which is a different skill set.
Yeah. Right. What used to be this is what best leaders or great leaders do is now become, this is what all leaders need to do.
Yeah.
So that is a shift.
That's a major shift. Thank you very much for that. Eric, what questions do we have in the Q&A there? Are there any?
Yeah, for Amir, because you're working on that with the technical people, do you see an increased demand for the technical expertise coming from international, so that it's, if you're a Canadian engineer now has a chance to work, for anybody? Do you feel that already, and is it coming more in the future?
So definitely the environment is right now less depending on the border and geographic location. You have access to international resources as well. They do have access to the Canadian market. We have some restriction about like a code and standards and compliance and union and that kind of stuff. But for any product right now, it's not all about the local distributors that has the best product for skid or anything else, as well as the resources. I get many emails after pandemic started from all over the place, from tech companies in San Francisco directly seeking to sell you some products, to some companies that offering engineering work from India or any other places. And I even got some emails from like East Asia about doing administrative work, like $6 per hour, $10 per hour. So what that brings to what we can offer, we are not anymore a commodity for the clients. We have a unique competitive advantage, and that's the relationship that we have with the clients, that the knowledge that we have about their complexity of the problem and how we can add value to their operation. It's not just we are offering them 1 hour of a pipe fitter or trade person. It's all about what we can offer as a service, end user service that help them. The engineering construction environment definitely is much more competitive as we are moving forward. Unless you build some competitive advantage or new way of doing business that can hold you up and you will survive. I hope I answered your question.
Great.
Thanks, Amir. Anna, you talked about the changing, the expectations of employees changing, and is that true in terms of the field personnel as well as the office personnel?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll start by saying what's not changing. What we found is what's not changing is their expectation of those that support them or work with them that are in a office setting. So it's not that they expect the same level of response and connection, whether you're working from home or whether you're working from the office, that stays the same. We haven't seen as much change in terms of expectation just because of the very nature of their job as of right now. But things like what Chris had talked about in terms of, will you pay me if I'm not sick? If I'm sick, do I need to actually get in a truck with someone if I don't know that they have been vaccinated and or if they've just traveled? Those are some of the more technical, hard things. Is the person I'm working with really closely, I don't know if they're ill or if they're vaccinated and I have vulnerable people at home. It's not about the work environment. It's more so around the safety aspect of it. That's the piece that's coming up for people.
Thank you. Stephen, this one's for you, that just along that same vein in terms of the sick leave and other legislative things because you're dealing with small businesses, at least in Mosaic, I guess. So is that going to make it difficult for small businesses to thrive if those elements change?
Well, it certainly could. However, our obligation as employers is to treat people like humans. And if somebody's sick, and if that's what the government mandates, then that's the rules that we need to continue to play by. I would simply echo Anna's comments in that the biggest challenge we see is not necessarily in the legislation of how we pay employees if they're sick. It's more, are we fulfilling our moral obligation of sending a technician to perform a service in a home where that homeowner might not be willing to tell us COVID screening questions? Are we fulfilling our moral obligation if we have challenges around rental units that we work in and we don't know who's been in that environment? It's been a very large challenge throughout COVID of how do we keep people reasonably safe while we continue to conduct business. And that's not going to change. COVID might be getting better in parts of the world, but this is something that is going to continue for years and years. And the question needs to be not necessarily what do I do if somebody gets sick? How do I, as an employer, reasonably prevent someone from becoming sick as a result of their employment? Because you don't know people's home environments. Do you have a pregnant wife at home? Do you have an elderly parent that you live with? How do you, or how do we as employers reasonably control the work environment and give people the freedom that they need to take sick time if they need it? Those are things that, I would argue that it's almost easier to do in a small business than a large one. As your business gets larger and larger and more complex and different work sites and different provinces, that becomes a very complicated challenge. If you're in the small mid-size market, it does get a little bit easier to roll out some of those systems and those processes in localized environments where you can more easily monitor case counts, more easily monitor vaccination records, and you can make those decisions a little bit more simply.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, you have another one?
No, back to you.
Back to me. Okay, well, that jumps onto another question for Chris, though. What are the legal issues that we have to keep in mind if you're considering remote and international workers?
Yeah, basically, it touches on something I mentioned before, which is that the employment standards legislation that's going to apply to those remote workers is based on the law where that worker lives. So based on our constitution, provinces have certain areas of responsibility. Other countries have certain areas of responsibility. And so the fact that you're in Alberta doesn't mean that Alberta applies to your BC employee or your UK-based employee or India-based employee. You need to be aware of those local requirements. And that's more than just employment standards, hours of work, that sort of stuff. It also applies to payroll deductions, tax issues. So if you've got an employee that's physically located in another province or another country, you're going to have different tax obligations. You may need to have a presence in that jurisdiction, either by way of actually incorporating or registering a business there, or you can make use of one of those companies that provides that service for you. So there are various companies out there that will essentially act as your employer of record in different jurisdictions, and they can handle things like payroll, taxes, that sort of issues for you. So you don't have to register a business to hire one person in that jurisdiction. So those can be quite useful. But think about all those issues. You'll probably need to get some local advice in that jurisdiction. If you, for example, want to implement a written employment contract, various countries have different rules about that. There are some countries, for example, where non-competition covenants or non-solicits are just illegal, full stop. So you need to be aware of those local restrictions and make sure you're complying with the laws there. And of course, if you're thinking about bringing a foreign worker to Canada, you have to be aware of the immigration requirements. You may need a labor market assessment. There's all sorts of issues with that. So keep the legal questions in mind, plan in advance, get that advice before you hire somebody or before you engage somebody, and make sure you're doing what you can to mitigate those risks.
Thank you very much. And here's a fairly juicy one for you. Can employers in Canada mandate employees to get vaccinations as a condition of employment?
That's probably the question that I get asked the most right now. It's probably on everybody's mind, and you've seen there's been dozens of different articles about this. And you've probably read that there's everybody from absolutely you can to absolutely you can't, and there's everything in between. Every situation is different. So if you're thinking about doing this, you should get some legal advice based on your company or your employer's specific situation. What I would say broadly is that there's a couple of potential problems with mandating vaccines. In the unionized environment, you have something called the KVP test in Canada that requires that policies be reasonable. And when it comes to things like testing or vaccinations, and it applies to drug testing as well, you may be familiar with the law on that. Basically, the arbitrators have found that medical procedures or collecting personal information like vaccination status engages legitimate privacy interests of your employees. And you need to have a reasonable basis to do that. And it's quite difficult to do, for example, random drug testing in Canada. And we've already seen some pushback from unions on things like vaccinations. So you may have a real issue implementing a mandatory vaccination policy for a unionized workforce. And unions have obviously access to the arbitration grievance procedure, which can result in those things being determined or heard much more quickly than the non-union environment. So I think that if you're in a unionized environment, and you're thinking about implementing mandatory vaccinations, you're going to need a really good reason for it. A healthcare setting, for example, might be a good reason. A place where workers have to work physically close together due to the nature of the work, that might be another place where it might be reasonable. And I'd suggest engaging your union and seeing if perhaps you can come to a mutually agreed policy about vaccinations. In the non-union environment, it's a little bit different. Employees don't have ready access to a grievance resolution procedure. They don't have a union backing them up, but the privacy commissioners have just released a joint statement, which effectively says that in their view, collecting vaccination status information is an unreasonable collection of personal information. Now, we could certainly debate all day about whether that's a reasonable position to take or not, but we do have that. So privacy may be a problem, asking people about their status. That may be a risk you're prepared to take as an employer, and you'll deal with the privacy consequences, which generally aren't severe. You can deal with that way. I'd say the probably more prominent risk is constructive dismissal. So if you're telling folks that to maintain their employment at your business, you're obligated to get vaccinated and tell me about it, you may have folks arguing that you've changed a term or condition of their employment without consent, and they're not prepared to accept that, and you need to pay them severance. So you have to think about that risk. If you've got good employment contracts, which limit severance entitlements and they're enforceable, maybe that's not a big risk for you. Maybe you don't care. You'll pay out the few weeks if you have to for those few employees that take that position. So there's going to be a bit of a risk analysis there. I think it's possible, absolutely, for employers to mandate vaccines, but it comes with risks, and those are risks to think about and manage before you implement that policy.
That's great. Thank you very much. So there's a severe tension between privacy legislation and safety legislation because they're not really congruent at the moment.
That's exactly right. And I mean, the government could make this easy for employers. They could say it's fine to get asked. They could say this is not a privacy violation or this is not a constructive dismissal. I mean, the government could pass that legislation, but we've seen a real resistance so far in any government in Canada to do that. We've started to see in some university contexts, mandating vaccines for residences. So we'll see, how that plays out. What I've seen from my clients is that there's a real resistance or concern about being the first. So there's a lot of employers that are thinking about doing this, but they don't want to be the first ones, and they don't want to bear the brunt of whatever fallout might come from this, a court case, privacy commissioner decision, or what have you. So, I mean, I think that as the vaccination rates increase to the point where you probably have very few employees that are unvaccinated or have some sort of opposition to it, it may become not such a big deal to mandate this, and you'll accept the relatively minor risk. But at this point, I think there's a real resistance to be the first ones, to do this.
So we just need a big, very brave employer to toe the line here, preferably a national one, because then all provinces are covered. Thank you for that. Next question is for Stephen. How will communication between companies and their customers change post-pandemic?
So throughout COVID, we've seen this massive change in the way in which customers want to communicate with our business. And the vast majority of our clients are transactional. They're homeowners or they're apartment managers or condominium complexes. And that transaction, typically is somewhat quick. It's within a week and it's maybe 2 or 3 phone calls. And pre-pandemic, we saw a lot of what Amir talked about, where we're talking about building value, and we're not just a commodity. We're doing A, B, C, and D, and we're building a lot of value. However, as more people went home and more people started to shop online or shop in the evening or shop when it was convenient for them, we've seen a massive transition into constantly just seeking out information and making purchasing decisions without interacting with a human. And to look at other industries that have made that massive shift, like tourism or hospitality, where I can book a restaurant table or I could book a vacation without ever talking to someone, we're starting to see that more and more in the home improvement sector, in that light commercial construction sector. And it's been a very interesting thing for our business. It's been a great technological challenge to overcome. How do we properly estimate and build value for customers without having a human-to-human interaction, whether that's in person or even just over the phone? The bigger thing, though, has come after that transaction is complete. We've seen something that we've kind of dubbed in our office as keyboard gorillaism, where everybody is very eager to assume the worst or write an email that is just the nastiest thing that you could ever really imagine. And until you actually re-engage in that human-to-human interaction where you're talking to someone or you're face-to-face with somebody, you're on the phone with them, that massive problem, like, oh, hey, there's a drop of paint on the floor, turns into the end of the world until you have that conversation to say, you know what, I'm actually a human. and I'm here and I'm going to solve that problem for you. And I'm not just some skeezy guy looking for a paycheck. It's been a big challenge that I don't see going away. Customers have had the taste of convenience in terms of talking about projects, planning projects, getting estimates online or over the phone. That's not going to change. People are going to continue to purchase in off hours, overnight. The big thing that we will need to adapt to is how do we effectively manage projects? How do we effectively communicate with customers? How do we effectively explain the fact that we are simply humans delivering a service to you, without having that keyboard gorillaism where people are flying off the handle for the things that are going to happen on any project. So I think that communication goes a lot more digital, and a lot more off business hours, and that human to human interaction will continue to decrease.
It is a really, really interesting one. I have not really thought about it that way. Keyboard gorillaism. It's like high school cyberbullying gone creeping into the adult work and into the business world, which is, yeah, not a very good thing. We've completely forgotten that somebody on the other side is a real person. That's quite sad. My next question jumps over to Amir. When we're talking about threats. What threats do the post-COVID world pose to small and medium-sized businesses, specifically construction, oil and gas? And how can we change those threats over to opportunities?
Yeah, the pandemic was an accelerator as well as equalizer. It accelerated whatever that we were expecting to happen in 10 years. Definitely we see in coming few years, and equalized all the privilege advantage that we had being in Alberta, being in Edmonton, or being in that region and having access to certain manpower. Others also have, because we are right now living in the digital era and the information is much more available. But what I see as a risk is cost increase. We talk about the sick leave, we talk about the other legal requirements. Definitely the cost of running business for business owners will be increased. Any additional week or two, it brings certain overhead costs. Then you need to be vigilant about it. You need to revisit your business. Some of the businesses being established 20, 30 years ago, and they have a happy balance and they'll just keep running generation by generation. They haven't seen that much disruption. And this disruption in manpower, in culture, in supply chain, in technology, these are all new variables in this equation. So that can be a massive threat for companies, especially the small companies that they have less affordability and less margin. Inflation is another one. Cash is everywhere and you see inflation coming. Cost of living will go up. Staff need or deserve a raise, but you may not be able to compensate in your service masters or your receivables. If you don't live on top of your finance and the business analysis, you will see some negative statements at the end of the year. Diversification is another trend is happening. Oil and gas definitely facing some challenges, but if companies, especially the small and medium size, are vigilant and agile enough that they can adapt themselves. You know, recently we saw a lot of investment happening in the hydrogen and in the green energy and in other sectors. Definitely the old landscape of business is changing. Change for small companies is much easier. They don't have that much overhead and they don't have long-term strategies as concreted for others, and they can quickly change and adapt with the new environment. But definitely that threat for some others can be flipped to opportunity for like a most flexible companies and take advantage of this environment.
Thank you very much, Amir. And my last question is for Anna, and that is probably a question that we need good time for as well. Is like, what can we expect in the last half of this year? there's so many words talk about post-pandemic resignations. It's become a word going forward, not backwards. And mental health. Gallup has a mental health indicator for companies to follow up on right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are three big themes. Maybe I'll start with mental health. So what we've seen during the pandemic and what we know, given the stats and the research, is mental health is going to be a big topic and a big concern for employees, for companies, and for benefit providers. So if 1 in 5 Canadians are dealing with some type of mental health issue, whether it's the employee or someone in their family, it is touching a lot of lives. So you'll see more training and awareness in organizations. So it's not that we're trying to create mental health experts, although mental health experts are being hired in organizations. And I think that's very interesting and different. And they're not in, not non-healthcare organizations are hiring them. But giving leaders enough information that they can be aware and guide people to the right resources if required. Costs around mental health benefits will continue to increase. It will, I think we're at a lot of companies are experiencing as one of the top 3 expenditures on the benefit side. So there'll be lots of conversation, training, and costs around mental health. The second is about the changes, resignations, new opportunities, people rethinking, as I mentioned earlier, rethinking and redesigning what works for them, what works for their families, what opportunities or options are available or choice within their current organization. And if that doesn't line up, then what other opportunities are there out there for them? So again, could be a costly aspect for employers with the change, and it will be different across the country. It'll be impacted by economies. And lastly, no one expects to go back. They expect it to be different. So even our language around going back, if I left and there were 6 people that I saw every day for the last 7 years, and every day I can count on that conversation that started my day, even if there may be only 4 there when I go back, because 2 may be there, maybe at working from home, 2 or 3. So if I keep using language about going back, I will think it is different when I get there, and it sounds different and it looks different, and all the faces that I expected to see are not there. So even our language is around what will it look like go forward, because it's not going to return to the way it was. And so starting to prepare people, even with our language, for allowing that end to be the end and shifting to something that has different possibilities for people.
I love that idea of languaging. I mean, languaging determines our mindset and the way we think and the way we feel about so much. And if we all commit to skipping the going back rhetoric and changing it in for a going forward mindset and a rhetoric, the future might be looking quite bright. Well, there's 2 minutes left here. I want to really thank all the panelists. We've been a wealth of diverse and valuable insights here. Eric, do we have any more questions from our attendees?
Just one sort of leveraging off what Anna was talking about with people reevaluating. Or Stephen, because you're working with entrepreneurs, do you see that like an uptick in more people that want to take that entrepreneurial route?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like people are seeking out hybrid work arrangements, the gig economy is alive and well, and everybody in their dog is looking to start their own business, whether that's, you know, to start their own business and build a company, or to start their own business and to own their job. I'm seeing a lot, especially in fields like marketing, where it's very easy. There's low barrier to entry to become a social media management expert in a particular field. It's very convenient for someone to, you know, come out of school or leave a career and get into a business that they own themselves. They control their own schedule. The only person that they have to report to is the customer. Absolutely, there's a lot of uptick in terms of starting your own business, and that's why we as an organization have taken some shifts towards our long-term goals, and we're actually looking at ways that we can franchise our business model to capitalize it, to help other entrepreneurs in markets that are not Edmonton have a business model that they can open and operate and be their own boss and control their own destiny.
It's great. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you very, very much for your time and all your wisdom in sharing with us today. Hopefully, Sage and Summit will have some more panel discussions. It's definitely a lot more interesting than a monologue for an hour. And we'll hope to see you all back at the end of July. Have a wonderful day. Stay cool. News from Vancouver is cooling down. We might cool down here in Alberta soon enough as well. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Take care.